World Affairs Roundup, next on International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs at UWM and Milwaukee Public Television present International Focus, a global magazine linking Wisconsin and the world.
Welcome to International Focus. I'm Doug Savage, Assistant Director of the Institute of World Affairs at UWM, with another edition of our World Affairs Roundup. Today we'll be looking at Caucasus calling. 2 days after a deadly suicide bombing in Moscow, for which a Chechen separatist leader has claimed responsibility, more explosions targeting police rocked the Caucasian region of Dagestan. What's behind this latest round of violence, and how might Moscow respond? In the White House woodshed, the recent White House meeting between Barack Obama and Israeli PM Benjamin Netanyahu was characterized by one Israeli newspaper as, quote, a hazing in stages. Is this just a hiccup in the relationship or a fundamental shift in the Obama administration's approach toward Israel? And the winner is, or is he? Following a narrow victory by a secular bloc led by Iyad Allawi in Iraq's national election, supporters of incumbent Nouri al-Maliki are attempting to use procedural maneuvers to reverse the results. As the nation waits for a new government, what do the results say about the state of sectarianism in Iraqi society? With friends like these, during his surprise trip to Afghanistan, President Obama met with President Karzai to underscore Washington's as yet unfulfilled expectations. How important is this ostensible ally to the U.S. strategy in Afghanistan, and is there an alternative? For a closer look at these stories and more, we're joined once again by John Katzka, a retired U.S. Foreign Service officer who has conducted public diplomacy for the Department of State on 4 continents. Ann Hamilton, political scientist and coordinator of international studies at UW-Whitewater, who also served in the Foreign Service. And Robert Kraig, author of a number of articles and books dealing with the history and politics of American foreign policy. He currently serves as Executive Director of Citizen Action of Wisconsin. Well, welcome back, everyone, to International Focus. Well, I'd like to start in the Caucasus. John, maybe you could give us a bit of background on this region and its relations to Moscow.
Okay. Well, let's call them the caustic Caucasus. This has been, we're aware of the 2 attacks that have occurred recently, the suicide bombers in the subways of Moscow, as well as 2 bombs that went off in Dagestan. In of themselves, they're obviously troubling to the Russians, but there is a possibility of coordination between these 2 events. But going back into the Caucasus, I mean, this has been a wild frontier throughout the Russian period, through the Tsars. The Soviets were more effective in terms of bringing it under heel. But in 1991, when the Soviet Union fell apart, Chechnya withdrew from the Union of Russia, from the Russian Republic. And 94, the Russians went in and attempted to retake the place. And 96, they left in defeat. They came back in 99, and last year, I suspect not dissimilarly to how we dealt with Iraq, President Medvedev reported that the war was over and that things were peaceful again. What's troubling about the current set of events is that what had turned out to be a separatist movement in Chechnya has morphed into a fundamentalist Islamic insurgency, and it has spilled over into the adjoining provinces of Dagestan and Ingushetia, so that it is much more troubling for Moscow now. What's likely to happen as a result? I think Moscow is probably going to come up with a traditional Russian response, which is going to be overkill. That it would be probably open season on people who look like they come from that particular part of the world in European Russia. So it's going to be a difficult time ahead. But it might also be a good time for us to be talking to the Russians about terrorist policies around the world. So they may be much more agreeable to open discussions on that.
Well, and other than obviously wanting to quell this kind of violence and secondarily not wanting any portion of your territory to be restive and secede, what is the value to Moscow of these regions?
Well, I think it's geopolitical. I mean, it's in a very, very important region of the world, down by the Caspian Sea. Lots and lots of oil down there. There are other, Russia has 89 regions in it, even after the breakup of the Soviet Union, and a number of them have this republic status. When the Soviet Union broke up, there were a lot of experts who were talking about other parts of it breaking away, such as in the diamond-rich area in Siberia. But that didn't happen. The main problem occurred in the Caucasus, and the Russians have fought to keep it, I think, primarily because of its geopolitical significance, not only for energy resources, but also because of what John was talking about, that they fear that this would become the staging ground for Islamic attacks on Russia. And I think that's one of the reasons, as far as what this means, I think that it could be significant. It could be the beginning of a series of attacks, and I think that what we'll see playing out is this rivalry between Putin and Medvedev. And I think we have to remember that in 1999, Putin had only been prime minister for about 3 months when there were these 2 attacks on apartment buildings around Moscow, and he used that as the reason to go in and just obliterate Chechnya. They've never found the perpetrators, and there's been a lot of investigative journalism done on this, suggesting that the secret police actually set those bombs to give them. I mean, and I'm not using the conspiracy theory, but I've seen enough reporting on this to think that there might be something to it. So I think we're going to see Putin possibly using this as a way to, he's retained his power, but in the power struggle with Medvedev as well.
And Robert, what do we see in these republics in terms of Moscow's mechanism through which it is attempting to exert control, and what kinds of governments are there?
They never, even in the Russian imperial period, really integrated the area, especially the North Caucasus, and the way they brutally repressed Chechnya, they've actually created this terrorist movement and created a strong Islamicist movement, and it's stronger in the other republics around it within the Russian Federation because they don't have as strong a control. They have a strong man in charge of Chechnya that keeps things very much under wraps. But this is a very good example of where, what you reap, you will sow. That they have an approach to holding on to these republics as creating a strong underclass, a lot of poverty, and a lot of angry people who are motivated on his religious grounds. And there are probably going to be more terrorist attacks, more brutality, more violence won't solve the problem. And quite frankly, the Chechens are a pretty stout people. I remember my brother spent a year in Russia in the early 90s, and before the war, and he thought they were very intimidating people just to run into. So they have that traditional, people in the Caucasus are known to be a very stout and strong people, and this is going to be an ongoing terrorist war because that's the only outlet these republics have. So for all the reasons Anne suggested, Russia is not going to let this area go, but I don't see creating a cloud of dust and having a scorched earth policy is going to resolve this. It's going to lead to more terrorism in the future, most likely.
There's another important reason why they won't let it go. First, I don't think that they can think in terms of letting territory go. They're an imperial power, an expansionist power. The second part is that this would be, as they are attempting to regain control over the other parts of the former Soviet Union, this would be a terrible message to be going down. Also, I wouldn't say that there is no distance between Medvedev and Putin at this time. Putin's in charge, Medvedev just happens to be the president. That's my read.
Well, and we could move on to Israel. We had a very atypical meeting between an Israeli head of state and the American president with Mr. Netanyahu's visit. What is the background and sort of the subtext leading up to the sort of frosty reception that Netanyahu got in the White House?
The background going back to 48? No, 47. No. The settled...
In 12 minutes.
the story as it broke had to do with Vice President Biden went over to Israel supposedly to mend fences because there had been somewhat frosty relations already between the Obama administration and the Netanyahu administration. And when he got there, and he has been a longtime friend of Israel, they announced that they were going to build, I think it's 16 new settlements in Jerusalem. The Israelis are saying they're not settlements because for reasons because they're in Jerusalem, but the point is that this came at a very bad time, and it speaks to the whole core of the peace process because it has to do with Jerusalem and it has to do with settlements, which are the two areas that are considered the most intractable in terms of the peace. And this was right when Biden, through George Mitchell, was supposed to be initiating a series of indirect talks. And this, that visit went very poorly, and it's followed up by this visit to Washington with Netanyahu, and so there's been a lot of back and forth. It's been very unpleasant.
Well, and Robert, even before this visit, there's been a certain almost unprecedented linkage between the wider U.S. strategic interests in the Middle East and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I'm thinking of General Petraeus' statement. Tell us a little bit about that.
And Vice President Biden echoed it as well, and it is that the festering conflict between Israel and Palestine is a great recruiting device for Islamicists all over the world in Afghanistan and Iraq. And so it is a threat to American foreign policy in general not to resolve it. And there's increasing frustration that Netanyahu and his coalition are going in absolutely the wrong direction. They are actually doing things that make it impossible to have a peace settlement. And so it's interesting that right after his healthcare victory, with the most sweeping economic and social legislation in 40 years, some people think he felt emboldened to take this stand in the White House against Netanyahu. And I think it's about time that there needs to be counter pressure if we're going to have any chance of George Mitchell's peace process, that the one he's trying to help bring about, actually going forward. And Israel is isolating itself even from its strongest allies by the positions they're taking and by the settlements in East Jerusalem. So I think it's a very interesting time for Israeli-U.S. relations, but this sort of pressure seems to be very necessary right now.
There's two interesting aspects of this that we haven't focused on yet, and that is, one is there's a resemblance between what Netanyahu tried to do with Obama and what Nikita Khrushchev did with Kennedy in terms of bullying someone who we thought was inexperienced and not capable of taking his on. The second is a story that keeps floating around, that the real story is not the issue of building settlements, but it's a settlement process that may be for dealing with Jerusalem and a number of issues in the Israeli-Arab relationship that Netanyahu doesn't want to see come up. And so maybe he is, I don't know how this feeds into it, but it's something that we were pushing.
Well, we've got just about a minute before our break. There's some concerns on the Israeli front that the settlement that John's talking about might just be imposed, is there not?
Yeah, they're concerned with this idea of indirect talks, and that, I mean, at least that's what they're playing up in the public rhetoric. The public opinion in Israel is very, very split, and so and a lot of people in Israel, Israelis, are not necessarily very happy with this settlement issue as well. So I think that could also be for public consumption at home to try and get more support for Netanyahu's government. But it's interesting. It's sort of analogous to what Karzai is doing in Afghanistan.
Which is a story we'll get to after our break. Right now, we'll take a short break and be right back with more International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back to International Focus and our World Affairs Roundup. Well, let's move now to Iraq and the election, which came and went, and we're still waiting for a result. John, tell us what the situation is there.
Well, it's very complicated. Either way, the way this turns out, we're talking about the difference between 2 votes that would separate the 2 presidential candidates, Alawi and al-Maliki. What's interesting also is that there has been alliances that have been forged between various ethnic groups in this particular campaign, which I think is one of the more positive things that's lost to this. There is a challenge out there right now that has many, 8, is it? The 8 candidates who allegedly have ties to the Ba'ath Party could, by legal action, be removed from the rolls, and that would change the chemistry of this election. I don't know where that is and where it is in the courts, but that's an important consideration as well.
But the official results, a largely secular bloc won.
Yes.
And so if those candidates were disallowed and thrown out, essentially that would erode their majority. Well, and the question now, Ann, is really who gets to form the next government, isn't it? And then that's not at all certain at this point, is it?
No, it isn't. As John said, there are only 2 votes, so even if it shifts somewhat, there's no party that's close to being able to form a coalition, even with one of the other parties, the way the numbers break down. So there have to be, as far as I could tell, 3 groups that work together in order to form a government. And some people are even saying, well, maybe the 2, Alawi and Maliki, should get together, although neither one would probably want to be second fiddle. But you know, it's going to be very difficult to form a government, whoever is asked to do it. And although there were some interesting alliances that were made, the voting itself broke down largely on geographic and sectarian lines, which doesn't bode well, I think, for the future and the potential for violence should they not resolve this impasse that they're in right now.
Well, and Robert, did we see any surprising shifts? I mean, the earlier election certainly was straight sectarian lines. Is there less of that this time around?
Well, yeah, the secular bloc that initially won, we'll see. The problem is that the process for disqualifying candidates is controlled by the party that lost by 2 votes. So that's the problem. Wow. And so this may just be, you know, old machine electoral maneuvering, but it can help delegitimize. But the group that won, Alawi's group, is a very secular, and it's also multi-religious, multi-ethnic. So it shows the potential of having that kind of coalition. There's a lot of that in Maliki's coalition as well. The problem is the other coalition partners are very sectarian bloc, a Shiite bloc, and then the Kurdish bloc, which is nationalist. And so really the coalition government would have to come between these 2 blocs, but these 2 men leading it, as Ann was referencing, don't get along, have large egos. Neither one will be able to be number 2. You almost need to get one of them or both of them out of the way in order to broker this. But getting those 2 coalitions together is crucial to any exit strategy that the Obama administration wants to pursue. And so in a way, as bad as this looks, this may suggest progress, and it may suggest the possibility of an exit strategy, but there's still some major hurdles along the way.
If I could throw in 2 points. One is that there are 2 possible outcomes that look inevitable for Iraq. One is fragmentation. Iraq was not a real country before the British put it together. So it did take ethnic groups that were not well disposed towards each other and put them together. The second thing is movement in the direction of a mild dictator, someone who would bring stability, not unlike what happened in Russia when Putin came to power. The Russians were looking for that stability and order, and increasingly I'm hearing is that the Iraqis are looking for something like that as well.
And what about the role of Iran in all of this? I know particularly the Alawi camp was saying that, you know, there's been a lot of contrivance and fiddling from the sidelines by Iran. How does that play into all of this?
Well, it's speculative. Well, I'm sure there's evidence, but as far as what we know from the newspapers, and I know, but the people, the group that's supposed to be that's objecting to the results and saying that the candidates need to be the ones who won need to be disqualified. One of the leaders is Chalabi, who used to be a great ally of the U.S., but no longer is, and does seem to have very, very close ties to Iran. And there's a lot of discussion that Iran has been very much involved. So,
well, speaking of Iran, let's go to another topic.
Afghanistan.
Afghanistan, and President Karzai has actually been spending some time in Tehran. We had another case of a less than amicable meeting between President Obama and an ostensible ally. John, tell us a little bit about that.
That was complicated. I mean, I put it in the camp that Karzai has nothing to lose by standing up to the United States. He, in fact, gains a great deal domestically by showing that he can resist being pushed around by the White House. We come in, and this is where I have a problem with our entire Afghan program. We have two largely competing goals that we have in mind. One is to make Afghanistan free of a terrorist sanctuary. The second goal is we want to transform this society into something that more resembles us, thinking we're going to help them, and we probably are. But the two goals in my mind are not just competing, they're mutually, if you pursue one too much, you can't do the other. And so I don't know how we're going to resolve this, and we haven't yet.
Well, Robert, it seems that you know, someone like Mr. Karzai is indispensable to the American program. I mean, we certainly need a stable central government that has the hearts and minds of its people. But our ambassador in Kabul had a scathing assessment of him recently. Did you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, this was leaked, but he wrote a message back to Secretary of State Clinton saying that Karzai has done none of what needs to be done as far as nation building, as far as corruption, has no inclination to do it or to extend security, and is not a reliable partner. And this is, well into this process. I think any observer, it's amazing that this is within the administration. I think objective observers would agree. And so I think the strategy is fundamentally flawed. You cannot, just going in and stabilizing it through force and not having any viable central government and having a corrupt government based on warlords of someone like Karzai, who's very late in his career, he's not going to change his spots here, is not viable. And so frankly, there needs to be an exit strategy, particularly when you consider that what we're supposed to be fighting there, world terrorism, isn't really there to be fought, to be honest, as far as al-Qaeda. So this whole pretext came out of a campaign promise to be tough in Afghanistan instead of Iraq, and they need to find a way, unlike Lyndon Johnson, who went down in Vietnam, which is parallel to the whole healthcare thing. It's the boldest thing since Johnson. They're going to go down on Afghanistan unless they admit that they were wrong and find an exit strategy, I think.
But don't you think that it's an overstatement to say that Afghanistan has ever had a central government? I mean, this is a collection of warlords and tribal groups, and it always has been. I mean, that's why the Brits lost there, that's why the Russians lost there, and that's maybe why we will lose there, because we don't recognize the reality on the ground.
Absolutely.
And there's not only, I mean, there's the animosity between Karzai and now Obama, but also if they don't have a strong leader who's willing to work with us to try and change some of that reality, instead we have somebody who's talking about us wanting to occupy the country and saying that we have bad intentions, and we're trying to win the hearts and minds of the Afghan people, in theory.
Well, we've got just a few minutes left, and we do have another really late-breaking story in the breakaway republic.
How late-breaking is this story?
Well, in the Republic of Plutonia, it seems a routine inspection has found that there is now a program underway to actually weaponize cabbage production into toxic gas.
No.
And I think we've got a statement by the Plutonian government we could put up. in which they're saying the Plutonian government does not have, nor does it seek, an agricultural weaponization program. We do, however, maintain our internationally recognized right to cabbage cultivation for peaceful culinary purposes.
Do you think this is fermenting revolt?
I think it is. Now, if you look, there's some satellite imagery which would belie that statement. Here you'll see an underground storage bunker. There's hidden cabbage fields, clandestine factory, and remarkably, night vision imagery in which a plutonian scientist is working significantly with an apparent North Korean advisor who is transferring kimchi.
Looks like kimchi. Right.
Well, I mean, I think this does show that not everything organic is good for you, but even more significantly, I think the neocons are looking for an excuse to invade other countries around the world, and so this will be a godsend to them.
I just don't know how to deal with this. I think they should turn over a new leaf.
Well, hopefully, within the coming year, we'll resolve this problem. So if we look forward to next April 1st, we will have sorted it all out. In the meantime, to our viewers, we look forward to seeing you next time on International Focus.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website.